Just to give us yesterday in a nutshell so that we can find our bearing for today, right? We suggested in the Mishnah that there's three scenarios. There could be a scenario of someone who had no Jewish background whatsoever, so isn't even aware of the concept of Shabbat. So if that person one day becomes aware of the whole concept of Shabbat, and that they've transgressed many melachot over many Shabbatot, they only bring one korban, because their error, so to speak, was the fact they were unaware of Shabbat. Then we talked about someone who was on a journey and lost track of time, and the Gemara will talk extensively about that example today at the end of the daf, and what remedies there are for that. But if the person realizes that there is a concept of Shabbat but doesn't know when Shabbat is, so we said that when they find out later, then they would bring a korban for each and every Shabbat, because their error was they just didn't know when it was Shabbat. And then finally, the last situation we talked about was someone who's aware of the concept of Shabbat, is aware that today is Shabbat and that there are certain melachot that are not permitted, but he went and transgressed certain melachot, I guess not understanding what they were. That's the discussion for today. And then we said that in that case he's chayav for every av melacha that he transgressed. Now we see that there's going to be a three-way machloket into understanding when the person is chayav a korban chatat, and what the distinction is between mezid and shogeg. We saw that Moonbaz yesterday suggested that a person is shogeg for the simple reason that they don't understand that if they are shogeg, that they have to bring a korban chatat. Okay, so their shgaga, their mistake, is that they don't realize that there's a korban chatat for being transgressing the sin mistakenly. So which the Rabbanan said, I don't understand your concept. You're saying that the person's aware that it's Shabbat, they're aware that this particular avoda is an avera and that it's forbidden on Shabbat, but nonetheless you're going to call him a shogeg because he doesn't realize that if he is a shogeg, that he has to bring a korban chatat. But then how do you call that shogeg? What you're describing is a situation where the person knows it's forbidden, and you're going to say that he becomes a shogeg because he didn't know what the penalty for being a shogeg is. But how is he a shogeg, right? So we saw that was the paradox that we left off yesterday. So now the Rabbanan who disagree and say the fact that he isn't aware that there's a korban for being a shogeg, but what you're defining isn't somebody who's really a shogeg, so then how do they define shogeg? So that's where we left off. Okay, so here we go. So the first part of today is a little confusing. It will get easier as we move along. So we are about we're about 8 lines down. Rabbanan shigagat korban, we said lo shmei shigaga. So the Gemara says Rabbanan shigaga b'mai. So how do the Rabbanan define shigaga then? How do they draw the line between somebody who's a mezid and somebody who's a shogeg? So we see it's a two-way machloket. Rabbi Yochanan amar kevan sheshagag bekaret af al b'shizid belav. Now Rabbi Yochanan moves it down one notch from Moonbaz, but not to the point where we would understand shogeg if you were talking to a lay person, right? So Rabbi Yochanan defines shogeg in a technical sense that he realizes it's Shabbat, he realizes that this is a melacha that is forbidden on Shabbat, but he doesn't realize that it would attract the penalty of karet. So he's a shogeg if he does it because he thinks that it's just a lav when in fact it's a karet, and that's what is considered to be a shogeg. So he's fully aware that this melacha is not allowed on Shabbat, but he isn't aware of the penalty for it. And
you could think it's a korban only, whereas that'd be different than Moonbaz.
Moonbaz said that he's not aware of what the penalty is if he's a shogeg. Right. What Rabbi Yochanan is saying is he's not aware of the penalty if he's a mezid. So he's not aware of what the penalty is, period, when he does it. So therefore, he would bring a chatat because he's a shogeg and that he didn't know how severe the penalty was for doing what he's doing. Now, the reason Rabbi Yochanan learns it that way is when we saw yesterday that there was a hekesh between a shogeg and a mezid, it didn't say anything about the avera itself. It just said that he's a sinner. So Rabbi Yochanan understands that to mean that even if he's aware that it's a sin, but he's not aware of the severity of the sin, that was what makes him a shogeg. Okay, now
a love and a love versus
a love versus a karet. Okay, so he says afal pi shizid bilav. In other words, he knows it's a love, but he didn't know that it was a karet. So that makes him a shogeg. Now, Reish Lakish defines shogeg in the standard way that we would understand it. Reish Lakish amarat shishkog belav vikaret. Reish Lakish understands that his mistake is that he doesn't even realize that it's a forbidden malacha. Right? If you asked me, a lay person, if you asked a lay person what would be considered to be a shogeg, you would say someone who's unaware that that particular act on Shabbat is forbidden, right? Or someone who isn't aware that today is Shabbat, but he knows that if it were Shabbat, you wouldn't be allowed to do it. That's usually the classic way the Gemara defines it. Either the person didn't realize it was Shabbat, or he didn't realize that that was a forbidden malacha. But you'll see that Rabbi Yochanan takes the middle ground, that he is aware that it's a forbidden malacha, but he's just not aware that that attracts more than a love. Okay, Reish Lakish gives the definition that the Gemara throughout seems to proceed, which is he just isn't aware that it's a forbidden malacha at all.
So, yeah,
okay.
Ignorance of the law makes it a shogeg?
Yeah, that's the idea.
No, he knew it's a law. He just didn't
right
know.
now,
The penalty.
but there is a penalty. The Torah still calls that person a sinner, and he has to bring a korban chatat, right? But essentially, his argument is he just was unaware that this particular issue was forbidden.
That it was forbidden, or it seems in the first...
No, Rabbi Yochanan holds he's not aware of the penalty, and Reish Lakish argues that he's not aware that it's even a sin, right?
Yeah, this is the way I understand.
Okay, so any case, the Gemara now wants to understand how each of them derived their definition. Amar Rava Maitam Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, because he says like this: Amar Kra Sher Lo Tasena Ve'Ashem. So the pasuk says that he did something that you shouldn't do, and he's guilty, meaning ad shishgog bilav v'karet sheba. In other words, that the person did it unintentionally. So unintentionally, according to Reish Lakish, means that he wasn't even aware that he was sinning. That was his mistake. His mistake was he thought what he was doing was fine, and it wasn't. Rabbi Yochanan, so how does Rabbi Yochanan understand the pasuk? Because the pasuk seems to suggest that the person made a mistake and did something that he wasn't supposed to do, but he only did it because he didn't realize that he wasn't supposed to do it. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Haikra de Reish. So the Gemara asks that, Rabbi Yochanan Haikra de Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Mayavile. How does he understand the pasuk? He says, Mi bayale leketanya, uses it for the following derivation. It says, Me ama aretz prat lemumar, that the person who did the sin unintentionally was an ama aretz, an ordinary person, as opposed to someone who's a mumar, who's inclined to violate the halacha. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon, he learns like this: Asher lo ta'asena ve'Hashem, meaning Hashav mi yediato mevi korban al shigagato. In other words, he learns that, and the next pasuk says right after this that the sin becomes known to him, and then he atones, right? So that means that only one who would not have done the same act if someone had explained to him that it was forbidden brings a korban. Lo shav miyidiato eino mivi korban al shigato. But if someone would explain to him later, oh, by the way, did you know that that's a forbidden malacha? And he says, so who cares? So then he doesn't bring a korban. So that's how Rabbi Yochanan uses the pasuk that the issue is that the drasha from the pasuk is to teach you that it's only someone who has remorse that brings a korban, not someone who doesn't have any remorse.
Well, how did that go?
Okay. So now let's try and take a look from a Mishnah that's coming up and see if we can resolve how the Mishnayot seem to interpret shogeg. So Tznan. So here's the famous Mishnah that we're going to get to shortly. Avot melachot arba'im chaser achat. There are 40 avot melacha, less one on Shabbat. So 39 of melachot. So Vavinan Ba, we ask Minyana Lamali. Okay, we can all count. Presumably most of us can count to 39. So why would I need a number? Why do I need somebody to tell me that there's 39 when I can go down the list and see there's 39?
Without calculus.
Yeah, without calculus, right. Every idiot knows how to count to 39, right? V'amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shima san kulan behelem echad, chayav al kol achat v'achat. So Rabbi Yochanan taught us, and this is the very famous answer, to teach you that if you did all of them in one act of unawareness, that you'd be chayav 39 times. Okay, so how can that happen, right? How can that happen? Remember, we're talking to Rabbi Yochanan now, right? Rabbi Yochanan's the one who's saying that if you did them all, you'd be chayav for each and every one. But how does that happen? Bizadon Shabbat v'shigat milachot. Okay, the only way that could happen is if you knew it was Shabbat, you just don't happen to know the details of which milachot are permitted and which ones aren't, right? Okay, so Bishan Rabbi Yochanan Damar Kevan Sheshagag B'Karet Afal Pi Shezid B'Lav Mishkachat La. So when Rabbi Yochanan says that the person's mistake is that he doesn't realize that these milachot attract a penalty of karet, even though he knows they're forbidden, mishkachat la kigon diyadala l'shabbat bilav. So this works according to Rabbi Yochanan because he can say that he knew that there's a concept of Shabbat, and he knew that there's a concept that certain milachot are not allowed to be done, but he didn't realize that they have the penalty of karet, and then he went and did all of them. Ela the Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Damar Shishkog Bilav Ubikaret Diyadala L'Shabbat Bimai. So, but if you're going to say it's going to Reish Lakish, now I find the question here is lame. Okay, so I'm going to explain it, but I think it's lame. But if you explain it according to Reish Lakish, how do you say that he was aware of Shabbat and not aware of any of the melachot, right? And then he went and did these 39, now he's chayav 39 times. But how could you be aware of the concept of Shabbat and not have any idea that any one of these 39 melachot are forbidden? So then what is forbidden on Shabbat? How can you have a concept of Shabbat?
He doesn't understand how it works.
Okay, so that's the answer. That's why I say the question's lame, right? But the Gemara's Havamina is that if you have an idea of Shabbat, you got to have some idea, right? It's like saying, I know how to play baseball, I'm familiar with the game, and then you go out there and you don't know what a bat or a ball is, or a glove, or bases, or stealing, or any of the rules. So then what do you know about baseball, right?
I came across a guy last week,
yeah,
and I asked him to keep Shabbos. He says, yeah. And I asked the rabbi, does he keep Shabbos? He says, no. So I said, why did he say this? He said, because he thinks he goes to shul, he has a trulant, and he has kikul, that's keeping Shabbos.
Okay. So he goes to Kiddush Club, he keeps Shabbos.
No, I'm serious. He's a Balcher. He didn't know.
Okay, so as I say, the question's a little lame because they're assuming that as if you have awareness of Shabbat as a concept, that you've got to have some concept of how the details are filled themselves in, right? So the Gemara answers like Mendel's saying. So yes, he's not familiar that any one of these 39 categories a melacha that he went and violated is a lav. He's not aware of any of that. He's aware of tchumim. He's aware of certain concepts of Shabbat. So he had enough knowledge of Shabbat to say that he knows something about Shabbat, but he had no knowledge of these 39 particular things. He had knowledge of other details of Shabbat. He knew about other things that are forbidden on Shabbat, but he didn't know anything about the 39 39 melachot, or these particular 39. Okay, so it's not a terribly convincing question. Okay, so the Gemara abandons that because clearly Reish Lakish could explain it his way also, is that the person just wasn't familiar with the details, that's all. He knew the concept, didn't know the details. Okay, so now the Gemara asks, Man tana lehadatan Rabbanan. What about the following discussion? Who's the author of the following statement? Shagag b'zeh u'b'zeh, zeh shogeg hamur b'Torah. So the Gemara says that if someone was shogeg in both knowing that it's Shabbat and in knowing whether this malacha was forbidden or not, that's considered to be a shogeg. And Hazid Bizeu Bizeh Zeu Mezid Amur Torah. Okay, so these extreme definitions are obvious. Someone who isn't aware it's Shabbat or that it's a forbidden malacha, that would clearly be a shogeg. And someone who is aware it's Shabbat and is aware that it's a forbidden malacha and's warned not to do it, says tough beans and he does it, obviously that's a Mezid. But Shagag b'Shabbat ve'ezid b'melachot, what if he wasn't aware that it was Shabbat? He was aware that he was doing this malacha, but he thought it was Sunday. Or shagag b'melachot ve'ezid b'Shabbat, or he's aware that it's Shabbat, but he didn't know that this particular malacha was forbidden. Or shamar yodiani shemelacha zu asura. I know that this is forbidden to do on Shabbat. Aval eni yodeh shechayavim aleh korban olo. But I'm not familiar as to whether you'd be chayav for a korban or not. So what he's saying is he doesn't know if he does it unintentionally whether he's chayav a korban or not. So who's the author of that? And still we're saying he's chayav. So kiman kimunbaz. So that's clearly like munbaz who suggested that unawareness of what the ramifications are would be the definition of a shogeg who would have to bring a korban. Okay, so now Amar Abaye. So now let's go back to Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. The Gemara is going to bring a number of other halachic situations where Rabbi Yochanan would agree to Reish Lakish that the error is in the details, not in not knowing what the penalty is for doing it intentionally. So the Gemara is going to give a number of examples. So Amar Abaye, Kol modim b'shvuat bitui shen chayavim aleh korban ad shishgog bilav sheba. So Abaye says that everybody agrees when it comes to the shvuat bitui. Now the shvuat bitui is a situation where a person makes an oath to do something or not to do something, or that he's done something or not to do something, has not done something. Okay, a shvuat bitui, as we saw in Masechet Shvuot, we said that there are two that are for. In other words, it either pertains to the future or the past, and it pertains to whether I will or I won't. So you can say, I've never eaten salami, or I will never eat salami, or I will always eat salami, or I've always eaten salami, right? So in that case, we agree that he's only chayev b'shogeg, meaning he forgot that he had done it, or he went ahead and did it and forgot he made a vow about it, until he actually eats the salami, right? Or he's eaten the salami in the past. So, but not that you could argue that he's a shogeg because he doesn't realize that if he lies about this, he has to bring a korban, right? Now, this is one of the few situations in the Torah where there's a korban, even though it's only a lav. There's no punishment beyond it being a lav for having transgressed the vow, except that you bring a korban olah v'yored. So, man. So who's Hakol Modim? Who's the Hakol Modim here? Man, it's Rabbi Yochanan. It's Rabbi Yochanan who would agree to Reish Lakish that in this case you'd only be chayev if you actually transgressed your vow. So Gemara says pshita, but isn't that obvious? Ki kamar Rabbi Yochanan hecha deika karet, where Rabbi Yochanan said that a shogeg could be someone who's unaware of the penalty, is where there's a real penalty, where there's a karet, and that's his shgaga, his error, that he doesn't realize how severe a thing he's doing. Aval hacha deleka karet lo, but here there's no karet for violating the oath. So then, why would Rabbi Yochanan suggest that you could define someone who's a shogeg for not being familiar with the penalty of karet when there is no karet? So he says, no, salkadat amina hoil v'chayav korban chidushu, that no, because you could argue that because you're chayav a korban here for violating your oath, a korban olev yored, which is a novelty because it's only a lav, because we don't see that anywhere else in the Torah, but here you do. So maybe we would say that his error is that he didn't realize that the implications of making a mistake with his shvua would be that he would have to bring a korban olev yored. So you could argue that maybe Rabbi Yochanan looks at it more conceptually, that it's enough that you're just not familiar with the circumstances or the results or the implications of what you're doing, and it doesn't matter exactly what that is. So Kamash Malani tells you no, that Rabbi Yochanan would say that no, that it's only when it's an unawareness of the karet that the person could argue that that's shogeg, but not in this case. Here you'd have to actually violate what he said. Okay, so Meitve, I'm going to ask you, we're going to challenge Abaye. We say Ezu Shwat Bitui Lishavar. What's a shwat bitui that has to do with the past? Okay, Shim Amar Yodea Nisha Shvuazu Asura Ve'eni Yodeim Chayavim Alea Korban Lo. So we see that here's a definition that clearly goes against what Abai is saying, because we're saying what's a shwat bitui in the past? That he says, I know that this shvua is forbidden, but I don't know if there's a penalty for having done that or not. So that clearly goes against what we just said. So the Gemara says, Hamani moonbuzhi. That is moonbuzz, because remember moonbuzz was saying it's enough that you just don't know what the penalty is for being a shogeg, and then you're considered to be a shogeg. Okay, we're going to leave the brackets because the brackets come to the opposite conclusion in this discussion, that Abaye is wrong, and as the Mefarshim point out here, clearly either Abaye is right or Abaye is wrong. So it's not possible that the Gemara would have presented both of these, and the more compelling one is the first one. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to give another example. V'amar Abaye akol modim betruma she'en chayavim aleh chomesh ad shishkov bilav sheba. That everybody agrees by the concept of truma that you wouldn't pay the penalty of a fifth unless you made a mistake in the actual lav. In other words, you ate the food thinking that it was chulin, and in fact it was truma. Now what happens if a zar eats truma? If it was intentional, the zar ate truma, then in that case there's no punishment by the BAYT. There's no karet. There's called mita bidei shamayim, right? If you remember from Masachet Kritut, we discussed the differences. So that's a very severe penalty also, but it's mita bidei shamayim, so we have no clue as to how that's going to work its way out. If he ate it unintentionally, Moshe, they ate your food, right? They stole your lunch. So, yeah, he's not supposed to be eating truma, right? Now, if he ate it unintentionally, like he didn't realize it was truma, he didn't know it was Moshe's, so then he has to give Moshe back, obviously, the monetary value what he ate, because it's like stealing, right? Then he has to pay a chomesh, an extra fifth, as a penalty for having eaten truma, and on top of that, there's a korban. So what we said is that everybody agrees that you don't have to pay the chomesh unless you made a mistake in the lav. In other words, that you ate the truma accidentally. So hakol modim man. So who's the hakol modim here? It's Rabbi Yochanan again, who said before that you could argue that shogeg is just not being aware that there's a karet. So, but here he says you can't be a shogeg just by arguing you didn't know there was mita bidei shamayim. To be a shogeg, you have to actually be a shogeg that you ate it accidentally, not knowing that it was truma, which is the way Reish Lakish defines it, right? So the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? Ki kamar Rabbi Yochanan hechadika karet, echadalika karet lo, because Rabbi Yochanan would only argue that you could say that a shogeg is someone who's not aware of the penalty is when the penalty is karet. So the Gemara says does the same thing again. No, ma'u detema mita bimkom karet omedet b'chi shagag b'mita nami l'chayev. No, you could argue that mita bidei shamayim and karet are pretty much the same sort of punishment, right? So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan could argue that just his unawareness of the fact that there's mita bidei shamayim would be enough to make him a shogeg. So kamash malan, I tell you that no, that's not true. Rava has a different answer. He says mita bimkom karet omedet v'chomesh bimkom korban kai. Rava disagrees with what we just said, and he says that no, that mita bidei shamayim is like karet, and the chomesh is in lieu of bringing a korban. So therefore, the simple fact that he was unaware that there's mita bidei shamayim would obligate him in the chomesh, and that Rabbi Yochanan would not have a different definition here. Okay, I think I suggested that you would bring a korban as well. I don't believe that that's true. So the chomesh is like his korban. Okay, so now the Gemara gets into something a little bit more interesting, a little bit more easy. So this will help us on our day. So we talked about somebody who got lost on a hike and he's lost track of when it's Shabbat. So what's the solution for that? Okay? We said that if one day he comes back, then he'd bring a korban for each and every Shabbat that he was away, that he wasn't aware that it was Shabbat. But what are the practical solutions if you're thrown into that scenario as to what you do? So Amar Rav Huna, Hayama alech b'derech or b'midbar ve'no yodei matay Shabbat. Someone who was on a trip, he's lost track of time. So what does he do? So the first solution is monesh shisha yamim u'mishamer yom echad. So he counts 6 days, excuse me, including the day he's on, and then he keeps 1 day as Shabbat. Okay? Chia Barav says the opposite. Omer mishamer yom echad u'moneh shisha. That no, he keeps the day he realizes that he's lost track as Shabbat, and then he goes 6 days beyond that as a regular days. So b'may kamiflig, the Gemara wants to understand, like, what difference does it really make, right? You're only guessing here, right? You're only symbolically trying to keep Shabbat, so what difference does it make if he keeps it on the 7th day or he keeps it on the 1st day, right? So Mar Savar Kibriyato Shel Olam, Umar Savar Kadama Rishon. So the first opinion holds that it's like the way the world was created. So there were 6 days of creation, then 1 day of Shabbat. So now that you're in a void in space, you have no clue what day it is, so that you do the same thing. The other opinion was that it's like the first person. The first person was born Erev Shabbat, so he went right into Shabbat. So the best thing to do is to, if you realize on a certain day you're lost, then the next day will be your Shabbat.
I guess Yoseph is not relevant, right?
Yeah, Yoseph is not relevant here. Meitve, and I guess he didn't have Kiddush Club here. Now we're going to get into this. So now the Gemara says, Hayam me'alech b'derech be'ino yodei matay Shabbat mishamer yom echad l'shisha. So it says that he should keep 1 day of Shabbat for every 6 days. So my love moneh shisha u'mishamer yom echad. So doesn't that mean he counts the 6 days first and then he keeps the day of Shabbat? So that's more like the first opinion. So no, the second opinion would say lo mishamer yom echad u'moneh shisha. No, it could mean that he keeps 1 day and then for Shabbat and then keeps 6 days. Has 6 days of full. The Gemara says I haki mishamer yom echad l'shisha mishamer yom echad u'moneh shisha mibayle. But the language doesn't fit with your explanation because it said he keeps 1 day for every 6, so to speak. It should have said that he keeps 1 day and then he counts 6. So be'od Tanya, we also learned Hayame alech b'derech midbar v'neu yodei matay Shabbat moneh shisha mishamer yom echad. So it's very clear here that the solution suggests that he keeps 6 days and then he keeps 1 day for Shabbat. So tiyufta dechia barav tiyufta. So that shows that the first approach is better. Now I always thought it was fascinating that when Ilan Ramon went into space, he asked this very question as to which day is Shabbat for him, because there were a number of different solutions. One was that, this question is more common amongst people that are, say, in northern latitudes during the summer or during the winter where there's no light, or there's only light, right? So what day do you keep a Shabbat if it's 24 hours sunlight or 24 hours darkness, right?
When is Shabbat over?
Or when is Shabbat over? Or when does it even start? So the 3 solutions that were outlined to him were that every 7th rotation around the world would be Shabbat. So every 7th orbit was Shabbat because you're seeing sunrises and sunsets, right? That was interesting, right? The other one was that he should keep Shabbat on Israeli time, on Yerushalayim time. And the third one was that there's no concept of Shabbat in space at all, right? So I'm not sure what solution that he chose, but he did raise the question, and there were a lot of scientific discussion about it at the time.
So he has 3 different Rabbanim?
Yeah,
No,
he got 3 different
Can't do that. Can't do
right?
that.
Unfortunately, they came back on Shabbat and it didn't work out, right? So, okay. So Amar Rava. So what does he do though on a practical basis of every day that he's on this keeping 6 and then keeping 1 for Shabbat? So Rava says like this. He's got a bit of a dilemma here. B'chol yom v'yom oseh lo kidei parnasato bar mahi yoma. So the Gemara says that on every day he can only do enough melacha to sustain himself, to keep himself alive, but nothing more than that. And on the day that it's Shabbat, he's not allowed to do anything. So the Gemara says, Vahu Yuma Limut, that so he'll die on Shabbat because he won't eat or do anything that could possibly be against Shabbat. So the Gemara says, no, he could solve the Shabbat issue by David Matmol Shtei Parnasot, that he should do twice as much work the day before to prepare for the day he's keeping a Shabbat. But the Gemara says, but the paradox is V'dilma Matmol Shabbat Davai. But the day before could have just as well have been Shabbat. He doesn't know, right? So he can't do anything extra on any of the days because maybe that day is Shabbat, right? So he could only do Pikuach Nefesh. And then on the day that he's keeping Shabbat, you're saying he can't do anything, so then he'll die that day, right? So Ella, the Gemara says, you're right. Kol Yom V'Yom Oselo Parnasato Afilu Hahu Yoma. So he'll have to do the minimal amount of melacha every day, including on the day he believes to be Shabbat. So Vahu Yoma b'may min kirle. So how is it Shabbat then? B'kiddusha v'aldata. He has Kiddush Club on Shabbat. So there you go. So there's a raya that there was Kiddush Club all the time. So at least he could have Kiddush Club on Shabbat. So Amar Rava. Now here's another solution. We say Imayam makir miktzat hayom shiatzabo osim alacha kol hayom kulo. That if the person remembers what day he left, he remembers like what day it was in terms of how far back in time it was the day he left, and on that particular day, every time it comes up in the cycle of 7 days, he can do melacha because he knows the day he left certainly was a weekday. Okay, so he has no idea what day it is he left, He can't remember that, but it certainly wasn't Shabbat. So he can 7 days later, at least on that day, do melacha for sure because it wasn't Shabbat. So so pshita, isn't that obvious? No, because ma'od tema kevan de Shabbat lo nafik, v'male Shabbata nami lo nafik, v'hai inami b'chamisha b'Shabbat nafik lishterei lemiyavel melacha trei yomei. So no, because you could start to do this or cheshbon. You could say, okay, I know I didn't leave on Shabbat, and I probably didn't leave on Friday either, right? Because no one would leave on a trip on Friday. And then you would say that, then if you extend that, you would say, okay, then I probably didn't leave Thursday either, because who would leave Thursday? So then maybe I can keep 2 days in a row that for sure aren't Shabbat, right? So Kamash Malan dizim din mishkach shayata mikre v'nafik. No, because you can't use that sort of cheshbon because it could have been that he just got a cheap flight on Thursday or he got a cheap flight on Friday and he did leave on Thursday and Friday. So the only thing you can be really certain of is that the day he left wasn't Shabbat. But you can't be sure how prior to Shabbat that is. So the chiddush here isn't that he's allowed to do work on that day. The chiddush is that he's only allowed to do work on that day, but not beyond that. Okay, so now we get back to the Mishnah. Hayodea ikar Shabbat. We says someone who okay, we say that the person is aware of the concept of Shabbat and that he transgressed many melachot on many Shabbatot, and that was what we were just discussing now, the person who lost track of time. So minahani mili, how do we know that this is true, that sometimes someone's chayav for one chatat for desecrating many Shabbatot, and sometimes he's chayav for every Shabbat? Because the first case we said is that if he wasn't aware of the concept of Shabbat, he would only bring one chatat. And now we're saying if he was aware of the concept of Shabbat, he just didn't know when Shabbat was, he's chayav for every Shabbat and Shabbat. So how could it be both? So the Gemara is going to quote two psukim that show Shabbat in the singular and Shabbat in the plural to show us that that's possible, that sometimes you'll be penalized once, sometimes you'll be penalized for every Shabbat. Okay, so he argues like this. Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Baravua Trei Kraik Tiva. There's two psukim. The first one we're all familiar with. Shamru b'nei Yisrael to Shabbat. So that's in the singular of Tiv. And then there's a pasuk in Vayikra that Shabtotai Tishmor in the plural. So Ha-Ketzad. So he says like this: Shamru b'nei Yisrael to Shabbat Shmira Achat l'Shabbatot Harbeh. So when Shabbat is in the singular, that would mean that there's one Shmira for many Shabbatot. So if you weren't aware of the concept of Shabbat, you only bring one Chatat for all of the Shabbatot you were over. Vet Shabtotai Tishmoru Shmira Achat l'chol Shabbat v'Shabbat. And the other pasuk suggests Shabbat in the plural. So then sometimes you're chayav for each and every Shabbat, like if you were aware of Shabbat, but you're not aware that today is Shabbat. Okay, so Matkifla Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, other Rabbi, he says, actually you should learn it the opposite, like this. Shamru b'nei Shabbat. When you say Shabbat in the singular, that means that every single Shabbat counts. So Shmira Achat l'kol Shabbat v'Shabbat. So that means every time you violate a Shabbat, you're chayav. Evet Shabtotai Tishmor in the plural means that you lump all the Shabbatot together. Shmira Achat l'Shabbatot Harbeh, that there's one penalty for all the Shabbatot. That would be if you were never even aware of the concept. Have a wonderful day, everybody.